when I think about people who serve in the military, I think about people who have worked in the airline industry, the FAA, for instance.
The frontline heroes, the doctors and nurses you mentioned.
Oh, my gosh. How many thousands of these people have lost their jobs or had to leave their jobs? Do you have any idea?
I don't have a figure on that. We should try to get that, but it's disgusting that any of them would.
Yeah. And are these specifically some of the people you're representing at the New Civil Liberties Alliance?
So we've represented a few different groups of people. We've represented some college professors. We've represented federal employees. We've represented federal contractors. We have not represented any doctors and nurses at this point. Not that we wouldn't, but our focus has been we sue governments only. So we wouldn't sue a private hospital, for example, but we have sued public universities. We've sued the federal government on a couple of occasions.
Mark Chenoweth, president of the New Civil Liberties Alliance. The thing, I know we've talked a little about this. I don't know if you and I have or not, but I've been interested in what is considered the conservative majority's point of view that the government can continue to insist that the shot mandate exists for entities that take government funds, but they said no, it was an overreach to use the Labor Department to insist every company that hires 100 people or more have the shot. What's the distinction made legally by the supposed conservatives on the bench, in your view?
Yeah, the distinction is that Congress has not given statutory authority to the president or the executive branch to order that private entities regulated by OSHA have access to that sort of mandate. It's not the kind of thing OSHA has ever done before. It would be a newly discovered kind of power. And the major questions doctrine, which we heard a lot about at the end of June when the West Virginia v. EPA decision came out, was actually mentioned as well in the context of the OSHA vaccine. But when it comes to federal employees or soldiers, for example, then the courts have been more willing to say that the executive branch has power, the president has power over those employees. I think it's worth mentioning, though, that there is a federal emergency use authorization statute, and the EUA statute says that you have the right to refuse administration of anything that's experimental. And that includes soldiers, by the way, unless, and the statute says this, unless the commander-in-chief makes a specific finding that's going to have to happen. And President Biden still has not done that. Even though they're talking about firing these soldiers, he still has not himself made that finding. He's been trying to do it through the Secretary of Defense, but that's not good enough under the statute. Now, what they've said is that these vaccines are no longer on emergency use authorization status, that the FDA has fully approved them. But the vaccines that have been fully approved are not available on the market yet. Comirnaty is not available in almost every instance. Every instance that we've looked at, it's not been available. And so they're saying it's approved, but the vaccine they're actually making available is still the experimental version of the vaccine.
You know, Mark Chenoweth, there are a lot of people that listen to this show that make their living in some form or fashion from the government. Either they work directly for the government or a lot of the work they do, their company contracts with the government. And as such, they have been directly threatened by the government. You better take this shot or else. And it's stuck for a lot of these people. And I guess, am I to take from that you'd better be very, very careful if you take a paycheck or you take money from the government as, you know, your source of income? Be careful, because with that, apparently, even the Supreme Court agrees, comes a shelving of your liberties. I'm kind of left with that impression. Is that wrong?
I think it's right. Unfortunately, Chris, I wouldn't have said that 2 years ago. I'm really gobsmacked that that's where we are as a country. That the mere fact that you take federal money or that you're a federal employee allows the government to stick a needle in your arm and put an experimental vaccine there. Look, if people want to get vaccinated, I think the vaccine's great. I think it's helped many, many people, particularly older people. I chose to be vaccinated because my father was going through chemotherapy, and I wanted to be able to take care of him during that time. But other people had different situations, and they made different choices. And liberty is about respecting those individual choices, and yet our government has not been willing to do that on this very, very crucially important issue.
Mark, what circumstances might find someone reaching out to you? If someone's listening and they think perhaps they have a case or they're a concern, I mean, do you consult? Can people reach out for help or no?
Folks can reach out for help. Most often we are devising cases based on things that we learn about through other channels, but we have taken cases Professor Todd Zawicki at George Mason University had reached out to us, for example. That was our very first vaccine case. Folks can reach out. They can go to our website at nclalegal.org just to find out more about our cases. But if they want us to represent them, it's going to have to be a case against a public entity. So that means the federal government or federal agency, state or local government. It could be a public university, could be a public hospital, some entities like that. And then it would have to be someone with natural immunity, because that's where our focus has been. And it would have to be against a mandate that we think doesn't have statutory support. So there's a lot of filters there. But
yeah, so basically if somebody worked for a county, a city, a school district, and they lost their job because of a shot mandate, and they have had COVID, they have natural immunity, can prove it, that's sort of the threshold that you might represent them.
That's the threshold, and then we're looking for cases where we can make precedent for a whole bunch of people, because obviously we have limited resources. We can't represent everyone. We've been contacted by probably 1,000 people at this point, and we've only been able to take a handful of those cases. And it's because we're looking for those ones that are really precedent-setting opportunities, that have the best facts, that have the best chances, that they're in jurisdictions where we think the judges will take these arguments seriously.
Yeah, that was my last question. Are you optimistic that you have some judges out there that are sympathetic to your position here, our position, which I just think is an obvious liberty position to me, but what's your read of the judiciary at this time?
I am optimistic about the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. That's Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, for example. I'm somewhat optimistic about the Sixth Circuit. We have a case pending there. That's Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. We don't have a case pending in the Third Circuit, which covers Pennsylvania. But that court has been better than some. I'd say it's sort of in the middle of the courts around the country. But we're optimistic that we will see, as these scientific studies that you started off this segment talking about, as these become more widely known, I do think it will steal the resolve of some of these judges. The thing that's happened is that judges have said they haven't been willing to look at the science. They've just said it's reasonable for these state and local entities to rely on federal guidance. But the problem is, Chris, you can't challenge federal guidance directly, even if it's bad science, because that federal guidance isn't quote-unquote final agency action. That's a little bit in the weeds. But you can't challenge it. And then if the judges are saying that the state and local entities are reasonable in relying on that, they're not really letting you challenge the science at that point either. So it's really going to have to be judges taking notice of these studies that are getting widely circulated that may change that sort of approach that they're taking, which I think is flawed.
I am not trying to I'm not actually asking you to confirm this, but here's my observation. What you just described about, hey, we found science that contradicts these edicts and we'd like to show it to you, and the court says we're not going to talk about that. That reminds me a lot of when people say there was no fraud in the 2020 election and the courts haven't found anything. That was so similar to me in what you're saying about the science of the shots and courts saying we're not going to hear it. That's exactly the same thing that happened in challenges to the 2020 election. Hey, we have some things we'd like you to look at in the court. We're not going to hear it. That is not said another way, it strikes me as people will say, well, you haven't had a court overturn any of this stuff. Well, if the court won't hear it, then what are we talking about, Mark?
Yeah, if the court won't hear it, then you can't draw any conclusions that the science is accurate just because the judges refuse to do something, right? That's for sure. And then, I would say that it's often the case, whether it's the example you gave or another example, that judges are the last ones to come around and believe, something happened. Particularly when science is involved, they talk about the judges don't lead the science, they trail the science. And that's definitely what's happening in this circumstance. Although, as I say, we've had this natural immunity information from day one, and this isn't unique to COVID. Natural immunity is true of every other virus that's come along. There's always been, whether it's smallpox or chickenpox, measles, whatever it is, natural immunity is something scientists have known about for a long time. And here the government was actively, whether it's Anthony Fauci or Deborah Birx or Redfield, these different people in positions of authority in the federal government were actively speaking out against natural immunity because I think they thought it would help get more vaccines in arms.